So this video is about Pagan Min versus Joseph Seed, but I don't mean who would win in a fight or who has the sickest style or anything like that. This versus match is between how Pagan and Joseph were both served in their respective games, and I want to mainly highlight how Far Cry 4 let Pagan Min down, while Far Cry 5 propped Joseph Seed up. In this video, I'm going to be talking about a couple other factors than just the villains, but factors that help to inform the player's experience of the villains. The villains' relationships to their main characters, as well as the supporting cast, and then I'm going to talk about how the villains are utilized in the plot. But first, let's start with an overview of each. Beginning with Pagan Min, I want to address the elephant in the room now. I'm aware that there is a good deal of people who are die-hard Pagan Min fans, even if they don't like Far Cry 4 so much. Personally, I think Pagan Min was a really interesting character, which is why I'm disappointed that the game didn't utilize him that well. There is also a popular attitude that Pagan Min wasn't actually the bad guy of the game, and that Amita and Sabal were the true villains, and that the Golden Path Rebellion were nothing but a bunch of terrorists like how Pagan refers to them in the beginning. While there is some truth to that, Amita and Sabal are not shining beacons of light who are shown to be just and righteous, whereas Pagan is the only one explicitly violent and cruel. You have to have a couple screws loose to think that Pagan is not himself a monster. I could go deeper into the Golden Path's leadership issues, but I really don't want to, because both Sabal and Amita were poorly written characters not worth discussing. Yes, Pagan Min isn't the only bad person in the game, but that's kind of the point the game is trying to make. And yes, Pagan has a soft spot for the main character, viewing him as a long-lost son of sorts, but he is also marketed as the main villain, displayed prominently on the box art like all the main villains in the recent Far Cry games are, and serves as a brutal dictator, killing and torturing whoever he wants and commanding a totalitarian regime similar to that of North Korea or Pol Pot's reign in Cambodia. So Pagan is a villain and an overall bad dude. With that out of the way, let's talk about who he actually is a little more deeply. Pagan is a really fun presence in the game. He is perhaps the one character that I had any attachment to, and it is because he's so damn charismatic, which is largely thanks to Troy Baker's performance, but also his dialogue is sharp and dry, with a character design that is so flamboyant it demands attention. You can tell who this guy is just by looking at him, and I think they did a great job of building an interesting villain for this game. Pagan also has an interesting backstory with the main character's parents, which I'll get more into shortly. That relationship does give Pagan more of a layered personality, but unfortunately the game is structured in a way that finding out all the important bits of that backstory, which matters to how the player perceives Pagan as well as one of the key points the game is trying to make, is not upfront at all. The player has to read notes and journal entries to piece together the events of the last generation, which informs Pagan's character. I guess I can appreciate that to some extent, but in my opinion, the game relies too heavily on an aspect of video games that a vast majority of people do not care for, and that's stopping the action to read. Like I said, Pagan is an interesting character with a ton of potential, but they bury a lot of it behind secret endings, alternative choices, and scattered primary sources. So this is about where my praise for him ends, and unfortunately, my complaints have nothing to do with the character but how the game utilizes him. Of all the Far Cry villains, at least 2 through 5, Pagan Min has a pretty limited exposure, especially in the first half of the game. Pagan Min shows up at the very beginning, but the player never sees him again in person until more than halfway through the story, after mission 20 of 32 for the main campaign. That's a long goddamn time to keep the main villain on the back burner. Pagan does occasionally give you the taunting phone call for some reason, likely because they paid for Troy Baker and wanted to get their money's worth, but these conversations are really just one-sided monologues that don't really add anything to the story, although they do inform a bit of Pagan's character and how he feels about AJ. Some calls are entertaining, but honestly, after a while, they just become white noise. Pagan doesn't really feel like an important character in the spotlight again until after the Golden Path breached the north section of the map, when the rebellion's proximity to him feels like a legitimate threat to his power. I think everything in the last third of this game handles Pagan pretty well. Unfortunately, his absence from the first half just can't be forgotten, and I think he is underutilized to this game's detriment. Far Cry 5 brings us the Seed family with its leader Joseph. Joseph and Pagan are starkly different, but their role in their stories is largely the same. Like Pagan, Joseph is the end goal for the protagonist. The player has to take on Joseph's cult and systematically weaken his power over the area before inevitably facing off against the cult leader to save the day. Not any groundbreaking video game storytelling there. However, I think Far Cry 5 pulls off with Joseph my #1 problem with how Pagan was used. Joseph is actually a physical presence and a palpable force throughout the entirety of the game. Just to show you what I mean from a pure numbers perspective, a quick search on YouTube for all Pagan Min cutscenes will show you results with the top 5 videos averaging around 30 minutes, including radio calls, etc. If you do the same search but for Joseph Seed cutscenes, the results for the top 4 videos averages at a length of 43 minutes. So right here, Joseph already gets nearly 50% more screen time than Pagan Min. 13 minutes may not seem like a lot more, but it really does add up if that time is used to flesh out the character, which this game does beautifully, to the point where I would look forward to the next time I'd see Joseph and learn more about him, whereas in Far Cry 4, I found myself wondering when the hell Pagan would ever show up. The player will typically see Joseph at least once per section of the map, after being captured by one of the 3 Seed family members who control that area. Not only that, but the other villains, Joseph's family, are constantly talking about Joseph and help flesh out his character even when Joseph isn't on screen. This does happen with Pagan and Yuma, but not to the same extent. I do have somewhat of a problem with one area of exposure we get to Joseph, but it is so interesting that I kind of give it a pass. After you kill each member of the Seed family, there is a close-up cinematic of Joseph in the dark eulogizing in reaction to their deaths to the camera. My issue is that it doesn't make any sense that we, as the player, would be seeing this. It's a bit of a stretch, but I also let it slide because I think games should have some artistic license, but more importantly, it builds character in a much more cinematic fashion, which I prefer over the dragged-out radio conversations with Pagan. Throughout the game, when Joseph has you as a captive audience, he tells you personal stories that can be quite disturbing, but help to round out who he is as a person and his worldview. One story in particular about the birth of his daughter is chilling, but it serves to build a picture of a man who is deeply disturbed, has had a hard upbringing, and one day snapped but was able to use his natural intelligence and charisma to build up something to be respected and feared, making himself an extension of God for those looking to find their own purpose in the spiraling madness of the modern world. There's a darkness in Joseph that exudes out of the screen, and I think the performance by Greg Brick and the script really helped deliver the sense that he is a man capable of preaching and gathering the genuine following that he has, while harboring a darkness within him that explodes in calculated bursts as the plot progresses. Joseph Seed is a deeply interesting character who I couldn't get enough of, and his exposure to the player feels maximized without ever feeling overbearing. In the Far Cry series, you spend all your time in the shoes of the protagonist, working to thwart the schemes of the villain and ultimately save the day. Naturally, there needs to be some relationship between the villain and protagonist in order for the games to have any dramatic tension, so I think it's worth going into some detail about how Pagan Min and Joseph Seed relate to the main character as well as the main supporting characters, since these relationships are the driving force in fleshing out character drama and plot progression. The hero of Far Cry 4 is Ajay Ghale, and he also so happens to be my biggest problem with the whole game. But this video isn't about AJ, so I'll try to keep my dislike of him to a minimum. After I first rip into him right now. AJ feels so much like a clone of his Far Cry 3 counterpart Jason Brody, but without the character arc, and he's such a disappointment. AJ is like if you took all the interesting aspects of Jason and just ignored all the development that went into it. If Jason Brody was smushed down into a flat Stanley version of himself, it would look like Ajay Ghale. The game pretends to give him an arc, but really they just gave you late stage Jason Brody and told you to shut up and play with your wingsuit. That's a problem. Okay, rant over. So, AJ is supposed to be a normal guy. He comes to Karat, the South Asian nation where the game is set, to deliver his mother's ashes to her homeland. He is found by Pagan Min, where the player is first introduced to the dictator and are told that he used to have some relationship with AJ's mother. Pagan gets a good intro here, then we have AJ escape from Pagan's nice meal to join up with the rebels. Or there's the secret ending, which I won't be discussing. My issue with how AJ is introduced is that he's supposed to be totally normal, but right away he's murdering people with no problem. And I don't even mean a moral problem, I mean he's just good at it, and it doesn't even seem to faze him, and then not soon after, he seems fully comfortable making massive decisions for the Golden Path Rebellion of a country he's been in for a couple of hours. I get that it's a video game and you need to do video game things, but AJ just rolls with it without really any internal conflict. So right out of the gate, AJ isn't the most interesting character to be going up against Pagan. This game does set up some weirdly complicated backstory between AJ's parents and Pagan, which doesn't get the attention that it really deserved in order to make me care that much. If I'm trying to understand the main villain's relationship to the main character, I shouldn't have to read anything. It should be clear, and after a certain point, trying to understand Pagan and AJ's dynamic got boring because of how one-sided it felt and Pagan's limited presence. The character of Ajay Ghale is maybe the mirror opposite of Pagan Min. He's a black hole where charisma goes to die and is about as flat a character as can be, which is fine, but it also means that Pagan's big monologues are largely bouncing off of a piece of unemotional plywood. So once again, this is another aspect of Far Cry's utilization of Pagan Min that shows that the game didn't really know what to do with him, and for all the depth and backstory between the two main characters, no real character conflicts arise from it. So Far Cry 5 was one of the games in the franchise which doesn't have a voiced main character. The player's character is just known as Deputy or Rookie throughout, and this game gives you the ability to customize yourself a bit, choosing your gender and some basic physical features. You may be thinking to yourself, okay, so how is this unnamed main character with zero dialogue a more interesting character than Ajay Ghale? Huh? Answer me that, you dumb prick. Well, I've gotta say that you do have a point. But honestly, I wish AJ was voiceless since his character is so dumb and cliche to me that he's a net negative, whereas the deputy is at worst a net neutral. That is my bullshit answer to your fictional question. But also, typically in video games where the main character has nothing to say, the game will rely heavily on the supporting cast to pick up the dramatic needs of the main character, and damn does this game have a great supporting cast of characters which serve the story well and bounce off the villains in a way that flesh out the world, build character on both sides of the moral spectrum, and provide much of the dramatic storytelling. Throughout the game, these support characters show us that Joseph Seed is a monster who is destroying all of their lives and needs to be stopped in order to bring peace. The game picks up with the player flying into the Eden's Gate compound in Hope County, Montana to arrest Joseph Seed for charges of kidnapping. The arrest party doesn't end well as the cult members all begin attacking, going so far as to throw themselves into helicopter blades to bring it down in order to save their chosen leader. From here, the cult grabs the different members of the arrest team and the deputy flees and is rescued by a prepper named Dutch who kicks off your journey to stop the Seed family's grip over the county. I will say that the idea of just marching into this heavily guarded compound with 5 people was definitely stupid, but once you get over that conceit, I think this is probably the strongest opening of any of the Far Cry games. It takes its time to build up, lets you know some of the core main characters that will be important throughout the game, and establishes what the player's goal is from the very beginning, while making the threat of the cult and the Seed family felt as soon as possible. But most importantly, the game establishes the power of Joseph Seed in that introduction, and despite the deputy being a nameless, voiceless vessel for the player, it's clear that Joseph sees something in the deputy. There is a connection that occurs right away, both before the arrest and immediately following the helicopter crash, where Joseph seems to have some sense that the player is going to be this force of chaos against his cult's mission of a better future, but that perhaps the deputy could be brought around to see the light and join the cult as one of its greatest assets. The game is already able to establish a clear and interesting dynamic between its main character and its main villain in this introduction, whereas Far Cry 4 struggled to ever get that interesting for me personally. I will touch more on the importance of the supporting cast in the next section, but overall, Joseph just felt like so much more of an important presence throughout this game, interweaved directly and consistently with the main character and the support characters you are fighting for. At its core, the story of Far Cry 4 is really about the struggle to overthrow a government and establish a new one. AJ is with the Golden Path, and their goal is to overthrow Pagan Min. Yet, as I've stated previously, Pagan does not feel like a real threat once the game gets going. Instead, the bulk of the story drama is driven by Sabal and Amida constantly bickering about decisions that really aren't that interesting and make them both out to be annoying characters. The story is pretty much mission after mission weakening Pagan's power and then eventually growing the Golden Path, but unlike Far Cry 5, AJ doesn't really get to meet the people of the nation he's leading a rebellion for. For a nationwide conflict, the game feels rather isolated with a small cast, which makes Pagan's absence even more noticeable since he is one of the few named reoccurring characters. Unfortunately for Pagan, he is sidelined by the overall plot of the game in which he is the main villain. Pagan is more of a background thought, a plot device to keep driving the action, but the big decision that the game boils down to is who is going to lead the Golden Path. Once all that drama is worked out, only then does AJ confront Pagan, where the players offered a really odd choice to end the game. Let me talk about this final scene with Pagan, because I have a lot of thoughts, and I think it highlights the main problem I have with him in this game. So once Karat seems to be falling to the Golden Path, AJ finally goes to face Pagan Min in person. The third meeting between the two characters and a moment that the game has been building up to the whole time. So during this final encounter, you get the choice to kill Pagan or to spare him. And I have to ask, why the fuck would AJ spare Pagan after spending the entire game with the goal of killing him? The simple answer is that AJ wouldn't, and that the player would only do so out of sheer curiosity, which still would go against the entire journey of the main character. Just to prove this point, only a few missions earlier, AJ killed a body doubles of Pagan, thinking it was the real man, and he did all this without a second thought. When this decision was offered, I found myself wondering what about the story would lead AJ to suddenly spare Pagan, and I could think of nothing. Pagan is pretty irredeemable, and more importantly, AJ hasn't shown any hints of compassion for Pagan the entire game. I know that the technical good ending is if you spare Pagan, because then we get the full backstory on AJ's parents, and you are able to place AJ's mother's ashes where she wished, which is the entire reason AJ came to Karat in the first place. Although I feel the reveal that, oh, Pagan wasn't such a bad guy, specifically for AJ, because please remember he's a very bad man, is such a weak one when it comes in the last 2 minutes of the game. I think a lot of my problems with the game would have been solved if this information was revealed before the decision to kill or spare Pagan came up, because then that would have put the player in a tougher position to make this final choice. However, the game was never building up to a decision between sparing Pagan or killing him, and as I just highlighted, even a few missions prior, AJ was hell-bent on killing this guy. So this final decision that the game throws the player's way feels utterly forced, and like the secret ending of the game you could get at the very beginning, feels tailor-made to go against the game's own narrative for the sake of a twist which should have been part of the main story instead of once again burying some interesting character motivation for the main villain. I touched on the plot of Far Cry 5 earlier in this video, so mainly in this section I want to talk about how the plot is structured and what the different stories serve to tell us about Joseph, as well as the ending. What you have to know is that the game is broken down into 3 sections, and along the way the deputy meets the different side characters who flesh out the world and make the threat of Joseph Seed and his cult feel real. There is a core group at each section dealing with their respective Seed family member, and there's also a hostage from the original arrest party held by each of the Seed family members that needs to be rescued. All their stories provide the stakes for the main plot and show the impact of the cult's cruelty, while fleshing out the world in a way that makes it feel like a real home to real, if a bit cartoonishly exaggerated, people. Nick Fry is a particular standout to give the player a sense of who the inhabitants of Hope County are and how the cult is affecting them. He is one of your 9 gun-for-hire characters, but he also plays a large role in John Seed's section of the map and pays a price for the resistance the deputy has been putting up. The importance of all these support characters is solidified by the end of the game when the final boss battle with Joseph Seed revolves around the player's allies. Somehow, Joseph has kidnapped them all and put them under his influence using Bliss, and the only way for the player to defeat Joseph is to finally free his support characters from Joseph's grip, from the cult's grip, and in turn, unite to stop Joseph and the cult once and for all. This ending shows that the game's story isn't so much about the deputy versus Joseph Seed, it's more so about Hope County uniting against a common threat in Joseph. Where Far Cry 5 differs from its predecessor is in story structure. The 3 different sections each tell a unique story centered around the Seed family members. John Seed tells us a story about wearing your sins on your sleeve, quite literally, and embracing and overcoming them in his twisted way. Faith gives us a story about submission, reflected by her own indoctrination and her use of Bliss to get others to submit. And finally, Jacob Seed is all about
I call the herd. It's what I do.
All of these separate arcs are interesting and serve to keep the story fresh while giving us a glimpse into Joseph's cult as well as Joseph's own beliefs, since his family are his heralds. Although, I do believe that the game struggles to tie all of these different narratives into anything more cohesive than the message, blindly following a crazy and violent man is bad. However, the ending of the game utterly flips any moral high ground the player may have had on its head, because just as Joseph is defeated, a nuclear bomb goes off on the horizon, and the crazy man ends up being right. I really like the ending to Far Cry 5. It was a refreshing last-minute twist that no one could have seen coming, and it ends in a very dark place. But it also serves as perhaps the most unique attribute of Joseph Seed. In the end, he won. No matter what you do in the canon ending, Joseph Seed is ultimately proven correct. Could this just be the lucky timing of a lunatic? Of course, and that's more what I think the game was trying to say, but at the same time, Joseph believes he won, and as a terrified onlooker, it's really impossible to deny him. For everything the deputy tried, for all the death and chaos on this path to stop Joseph, none of it mattered, and in the end, you are Joseph's prisoner in the new age, a captive member of his new family. In conclusion, I think that Far Cry as a series has done a great job carving out a niche for themselves where they market a strong villain and build a game around defeating them. I think that on paper, both Pagan Min and Joseph Seed were unique villains with a lot of potential. However, if you look at both games a little deeper, it becomes clear that Pagan Min was ultimately underserved by his game to both his character and the overall game's detriment, whereas Joseph Seed and Far Cry 5 have a symbiotic relationship, both elevating the other. Because of how well Joseph Seed is positioned in the Far Cry 5 story, pitted against the main character and their supporting cast, the level of exposure and time committed to his character's development, and a great performance with a unique set of underlings, I have to say that Joseph Seed serves Far Cry 5 as a better villain than how Pagan Min was utilized by Far Cry 4. While I don't think Joseph is the best in the series, I do think he's only a rung lower than Vaas, and unfortunately, that places Pagan even further from the top. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm prepared to get eviscerated down below, so feel free to jump into the massacre. Thank you so much for watching this whole video, even if you disagree with me. It really does help me out.